The neighborhood sat on the edge of a small Texas town, where the air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and barbecues on weekend afternoons. It was the kind of place people moved to when they wanted predictability and a sense of community, where you knew your mail carrier by name and waved to your neighbors without hesitation. Children rode their bikes in lazy circles on the cul-de-sac, and porch lights flicked on at dusk like clockwork. Everyone maintained their lawns with care. The houses lined up like a perfectly painted picture of suburban calm. Mornings started early with the sound of sprinklers, and evenings ended with families sitting outside, talking quietly as the sun dipped low. Residents felt safe leaving their doors unlocked, believing that the invisible thread of neighborly trust would keep them secure. For years this rhythm never faltered. Newcomers were welcomed with pies and handshakes, and problems rarely escalated beyond a polite conversation on a driveway. It was this consistency, this deep sense of normalcy, that had attracted many of the families who lived there, including military veterans, teachers, retirees, and young couples starting their lives. They believed that here, at last, they could breathe easily, away from the noise and chaos of the city. The place didn't just look peaceful, it felt like a living promise that life could be simpler and safer. But peace in such places has a way of becoming a double-edged sword. When routines grow too familiar, people stop questioning changes. They assume that anything new must already be approved or official. This collective trust and complacency made the neighborhood particularly vulnerable to deception. Residents prided themselves on knowing their neighbors, but no one had ever imagined outsiders would try to exploit their community. Over time, this sense of invulnerability became an opening, a quiet invitation for trouble to slip in without resistance. The expectation of safety and order had been so deeply ingrained that it was difficult to imagine anyone undermining it. People mowed their lawns, walked their dogs, and waved at strangers without much thought, never realizing how fragile their peace really was. The houses themselves reflected this optimism. Large picture windows faced the street, open blinds revealing the warmth of family rooms. Lawns had little decorative flags or garden gnomes, symbols of personality but also of openness. Driveways hosted block parties and yard sales. Even the local newsletter, a cheerful paper distributed once a month, celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and new arrivals rather than warnings or crime alerts. The lack of suspicion was part of the neighborhood's charm, but it also meant no one was prepared for what would happen next. This backdrop of calm, the soft hum of suburban life, the rhythm of small routines, would soon stand in sharp contrast to the tension and fear that was about to unfold, a jarring shift that no one saw coming. It began quietly at first, almost as if the neighborhood had gained an extra layer of oversight. The men appeared one Saturday morning, walking in pairs along the sidewalks, clipboards in hand. Their uniforms weren't quite professional, plain dark shirts with hastily sewn patches and matching caps, but to a casual observer they looked official enough. They introduced themselves as security hired by the Homeowners Association, claiming they were there to keep the community safe and enforce neighborhood standards. Their presence felt unusual but not immediately alarming. In a world where people are used to seeing contractors, maintenance crews and delivery drivers, the sight of a few men patrolling wasn't entirely out of place. At first, they limited themselves to simple interaction. They nodded to residents, asked about parked cars, and made notes on their clipboards. They spoke with an air of authority, dropping phrases like community policy and mandatory compliance to make their role sound legitimate. Most people didn't question. After all, the neighborhood had an HOA, and many residents disliked dealing with it. The idea of security enforcement seemed plausible. The men capitalized on that assumption. Their uniforms gave a sense of order, but on closer inspection nothing matched. Different brands of boots, patches slightly crooked, no badges or official IDs. Within days, their presence became routine. They set up small cones near the entrance of the subdivision, occasionally stopping cars to check permits. They left notices on doors warning of fines for supposed violations, grass a little too long, trash cans not stored quickly enough, unapproved holiday decoration. They spoke in clipped, stern tones, reminding homeowners of penalties for non-compliance. Most people, unfamiliar with HOA bylaws and intimidated by official-sounding language, simply obeyed. Some paid the fines immediately, slipping cash into envelopes as instructed. Others muttered under their breath, but complied anyway, afraid of legal trouble. The men's tactics grew bolder as they sensed little pushback. They expanded their patrol hours, showing up early in the morning and late at night. They carried flashlights and radios, further enhancing the illusion of authority. Rumors began spreading about how strict the HOA had become, but no one coordinated their concerns. Residents who questioned the men were met with vague answers and implied threats of escalation. The imposters carefully played on fear of bureaucracy and confrontation. They even started knocking on doors directly, asking for security fees to fund their operations, hinting that non-payment could lead to legal action or liens against properties. Some people suspected something wasn't right but hesitated to act. The imposters had created a climate of uncertainty, where neighbors no longer trusted their own instincts. If someone else had hired them, challenging them might backfire. If they were real, arguing with them could bring fines or worse. The quiet, trusting culture of the neighborhood made it easy for the scheme to continue unchecked. Residents went about their routines under the watchful eyes of men who didn't belong there, feeling a creeping unease but lacking proof to confront it. Even the appearance of the men was calculated to unsettle. Their uniforms, though inconsistent, were dark and militaristic, projecting control. Their radios crackled with static as they spoke in codes no one understood. They never smiled. They moved with purpose, pausing to take photos of houses or vehicles as if gathering evidence. This performance gave them legitimacy they did not have, and every day that passed without a challenge reinforced their hold. Underneath the surface, tension was building. The residents didn't realize it yet, but the same patterns of discipline and vigilance that had once defined their community would soon reawaken, sparked by an event no one could have predicted, one that would shatter the imposters' illusion of power and change the neighborhood's story forever. The first bogus notice appeared on a bright Monday morning, taped neatly to the front door of a modest brick house on the corner. It looked official at a glance, white paper printed with bold black letters, a faux logo resembling a city seal at the top. The language was formal, peppered with legal terms and deadlines. It claimed the homeowner had violated several community standards and owed a fee to avoid escalation. There was even a detachable slip at the bottom for payment. The resident, an elderly widow, felt her stomach drop as she read it. She had never received a notice from the HOA before, but the document looked real enough, and the amount was small enough that paying it felt easier than contesting it. She left a check in her mailbox as instructed, believing the matter resolved. Soon, similar notices began appearing on more doors. They were carefully tailored. Some cited overgrown grass. Others accused residents of improper parking, unauthorized plants, or unsanctioned paint colors. The tone was always the same, stern, urgent, and vaguely threatening. Each notice gave a short window to pay or face further enforcement measures. Many residents, conditioned to avoid conflict, complied without question. They stuffed cash or checks into plain envelopes and handed them to the men in uniform when they came knocking. The imposters worked their scheme like clockwork. They walked up and down the streets in pairs, clipping notices under door handles, slipping them into mail slots, and taking pictures with their phones to document the alleged violations. Their presence became a spectacle. From behind curtains, neighbors watched them, whispering among themselves but rarely confronting them directly. Some residents called the real HOA office, only to be met with voicemail boxes or long hold times. Without clear answers, uncertainty turned into submission. The fines steadily increased. What began as $25 for a trash can violation soon became $75 for a decorative infraction. One notice even threatened a lien for a non-compliant mailbox. People started budgeting for these new fees as if they were inevitable taxes. The men exploited this resigned mindset, returning like clockwork to collect payments. They even issued receipts scribbled on carbon paper pads, further cementing their false legitimacy. Intimidation was their silent weapon. They didn't need to raise their voices or flash weapons. Their uniforms, their clipboards, and their official-sounding jargon were enough to coerce compliance. Residents who hesitated found themselves facing more notices, more fines, and stern visits at odd hours. A young mother who asked too many questions found her car ticketed for being parked in her own driveway. A retired teacher who refused to pay received a letter threatening legal action. These tactics created a climate of quiet dread. The community's once friendly sidewalks now felt like corridors of surveillance. Neighbors who used to chat freely began avoiding eye contact, worried that speaking up might bring unwanted attention from the men. Children no longer played as freely on the lawn. The rhythm of suburban life, mail delivery, school buses, evening walks, now unfolded under a shadow of imposed authority. Each notice, each fine, and each collection added another layer to the imposters' control. Behind closed doors, resentment brewed. Residents began saving the notices, lining them up on kitchen tables, comparing them to past HOA correspondence. Some noticed discrepancies, the misspelled words, the fake seal, the unregistered phone numbers, but no one wanted to be the first to challenge the men openly. In a culture where most people valued harmony and order, confrontation felt risky. The imposters counted on that, using their false fines to drain money slowly and steadily from the very people who had built their lives around trust and security. Fear is a quiet, creeping force. It doesn't arrive with blaring sirens.
It seeps into daily routines, until people don't even notice how much it controls them. In the Texas neighborhood, that fear began as confusion, simple uncertainty about whether these men were real. The uniforms looked close enough to authentic. The paperwork had all the right buzzwords. The men spoke with the clipped cadence of authority figures, confident and rehearsed. They cited rules no one had read but sounded plausible. The residents, unfamiliar with the intricate legalities of HOA governance, assumed the men's authority was genuine. The imposters understood human psychology well enough to exploit it. They knew that a show of force doesn't always require violence. Sometimes it's enough to display confidence and consistency. By showing up every day, by repeating the same procedures, by invoking policy, they created a theater of legitimacy. Each interaction reinforced the illusion. A man in a uniform with a clipboard, telling you about a fine, doesn't seem like a criminal. He seems like a bureaucrat, doing his job. And most people, when confronted with bureaucracy, fold rather than fight. The residents' compliance was driven less by gullibility and more by a desire to avoid trouble. Many were retirees or young families, not accustomed to legal wrangling. They didn't want liens, lawsuits, or escalating fees. They didn't want to be the ones who challenged the rules, only to find out they were wrong. This quiet self-preservation kept the imposters in power. The neighborhood's collective instinct to keep the peace, once a strength, had become a vulnerability. Fear also spread socially. When one person paid a fine without complaint, it normalized the behavior. When another person accepted a warning without protest, it signaled to others that resistance might be futile. Conversations at mailboxes grew hushed. Text messages between neighbors carried the same refrain. Have you gotten one of those notices? I paid mine just to be safe. Better not risk it. The imposters thrived in this environment of uncertainty, their power multiplying with every silent transaction. Even the physical presence of the men deepened the fear. They walked with a slow, deliberate pace, scanning yards, speaking into radios, making notes. They never joked, never smiled, never acknowledged the children peeking from behind curtains. They embodied a kind of cold authority that suggested consequences. In a place where police rarely had to intervene, their stern demeanor was enough to unsettle everyone. This belief in their authority reshaped daily habit. Residents began double-checking their lawns, hiding trash cans earlier, canceling outdoor gatherings, and even changing their decorations to avoid attention. The men hadn't just imposed fines, they had imposed control over behavior. It was a quiet but powerful transformation of the neighborhood's character. Some people considered calling the real police, but hesitation stopped them. What if the men were legitimate? What if the HOA had quietly hired them? What if reporting them backfired? No one wanted to be the test case. This collective hesitancy gave the imposters more time to entrench themselves. They grew bolder, more visible, more aggressive in their collections. The irony was that the very qualities that made the neighborhood attractive, its peace, its trust, its orderliness, had now left it defenseless. Fear had turned neighbors into isolated households, each dealing with the imposters on their own, rather than banding together. This isolation was exactly what the men needed to maintain their scam. By the time suspicion turned into anger, the imposters had already established themselves as an unavoidable part of daily life, their false authority woven into the fabric of the community's routine.
At first, the imposters had focused on minor violations. Trash cans left out too long, grass edging not crisp enough. But within weeks they were pushing the boundaries of plausibility. They began inventing new rules that no one had ever heard of, testing how far the residents' compliance would go. One morning, a family woke to find a bright yellow citation tucked into the folds of their mailbox. The offense was a string of festive lights, still hanging on their porch 2 weeks after the holiday season ended. Another resident was fined for having a small decorative fountain in their front garden, accused of violating some obscure water feature ordinance that didn't exist. Soon, the imposters turned their attention to vehicles. They patrolled the streets like hawks, snapping photos of cars parked overnight on the curb and claiming it was against community parking regulations. They issued notices for illegal parking when guests stayed too long, and even threatened to have cars towed despite having no authority to do so. Their confidence was staggering. They stood in driveways, pointing out alleged infractions with the precision of real inspectors, their clipboards filling with fake reports. Residents who once felt pride in their homes now felt nervous about every personal touch. Garden flags were pulled up, lawn ornaments hidden away, and seasonal decorations taken down earlier than ever. A woman who loved tending her rose bushes removed the trellis she had installed because she feared it would be labeled non-compliant. The imposters had managed to turn the symbols of individuality, the small, harmless choices that made each house unique, into liabilities. These tactics also bred resentment between neighbors. When one family received a citation, they sometimes suspected a neighbor had reported them, not realizing the imposters were making up rules on the spot. Conversations grew strained. People stopped sharing tips about gardening or inviting each other to backyard barbecue. Fear of drawing attention from the security team made everyone shrink into themselves. The imposters relished their growing control. They spoke with even greater authority, citing imaginary page numbers from non-existent bylaws, throwing around legal-sounding phrases like mandatory compliance, escalation process, and community code enforcement. They wore radios clipped to their belts, and occasionally pretended to speak to someone on the other end about violations. All of it was theater, designed to maintain the illusion of power and keep residents off balance. As their tactics escalated, so did a single decoration or car parked in the wrong place could now trigger a cascade of notices and escalating fines. The imposters framed their actions as protecting the neighborhood's image and property values, words that resonated with homeowners who had invested their savings into their property. These justifications weren't just lies, they were effective manipulation, crafted to play on the anxieties of people who wanted to maintain order and stability. The threat of citations for harmless details was a masterstroke of psychological control. By policing the smallest things, the imposters extended their reach into every corner of residents' lives. Each citation was a reminder, we're watching, and we can punish you for anything. This atmosphere of hyper-surveillance made people self-police even when the imposters weren't around, stripping the neighborhood of the easygoing charm it had once known. Inside the houses, behind drawn curtains and locked doors, the conversations took on a different tone. People who had once greeted each other openly, now shared their doubts in hushed voices or private text threads. Couples sat at kitchen tables late at night, spreading out the notices like evidence, whispering about the strange men who had taken over their street. They compared stories, realized how similar their experiences were, and yet still felt unsure about what was real and what wasn't. Fear and confusion created a kind of paralysis. No one knew for certain whether the men were imposters or simply an overzealous new arm of the HOA. The idea that their neighborhood, a place they had chosen for its safety, had been infiltrated by scammers felt almost unthinkable. It was easier to believe the men were legitimate and that the fines, while unfair, were real. Confronting them would mean risking a bigger problem. This sense of powerlessness was reinforced by isolation. People worried about speaking up publicly. If they complained in a neighborhood meeting or confronted the men directly, they feared retaliation. Some imagined being singled out for more fines, targeted at odd hours, or even threatened. The imposters had created not just a scam but a climate of intimidation, where silence became self-preservation. Even attempts to verify the men's authority fell flat. A few residents tried calling the HOA, but the office was closed on weekends when the imposters were most active, or they reached low-level staff who couldn't confirm anything. Others thought about contacting the police, but hesitated. What if the imposters were legitimate contractors? Filing a false report could backfire. In the absence of clear information, rumors filled the void. In group chats, people traded theories. Maybe the HOA had hired them secretly. Maybe there had been a vote no one remembered. Maybe they were part of some county enforcement team. Others speculated darker motives: organized crime, a shakedown ring, or a gang testing the neighborhood. But speculation wasn't action, and the imposters understood this. Every day that passed without resistance made their operation seem more entrenched, more efficient. This silence also took an emotional toll. Residents who once felt proud of their neighborhood now felt shame for not acting. Parents worried about what example they were setting for their children by complying. Retirees who had lived through tougher times felt frustrated at their own hesitance. Yet even in their frustration, they felt stuck. No single household wanted to become the spark that drew the imposters' wrath. The imposters, for their part, cultivated this atmosphere deliberately. They moved unpredictably, sometimes knocking on doors at dawn or after dark. They never gave the same names twice. They hinted at secret lists of problem houses. They left notices without signatures, making it impossible to hold one person accountable. This shadowy behavior kept residents guessing and discouraged them from forming a united front. Meanwhile, the community's once busy social fabric began to fray. The weekly walking club stopped meeting. The children's lemonade stand shut down after one of the men warned the kids about unauthorized commerce. A neighbor who used to host poker nights canceled them indefinitely, worried about noise complaints from the imposters. The imposters' presence reached into every corner of life, not just through fines but through the slow erosion of trust and normalcy. Inside these homes, people rehearsed conversations they never had. They imagined confronting the men, demanding identification, calling the police, standing up to them,
but in reality they stayed quiet, waiting for someone else to act first. Their whispers carried both fear and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, the problem would resolve itself if they kept their heads down. This was the imposters' greatest weapon. Not the fake fines, not the bogus rules, but the belief they had planted in each household that resistance was futile and dangerous. By keeping everyone isolated and uncertain, they had turned a strong, close-knit neighborhood into a scattering of anxious individuals, each whispering behind closed doors but none yet stepping forward. He had chosen the neighborhood precisely because it promised calm. Years of deployments had sharpened his instincts and disciplined his body, but they had also left him craving ordinary routines, mowing the lawn, walking the dog at dawn, sitting on the porch with his wife in the evening. Few knew the details of his service. He preferred it that way, blending in as just another neighbor. Yet even as he tried to fade into civilian life, his awareness never fully switched off. He noticed the imposters' mismatched uniforms, their vague language, their lack of proper ID, and though he stayed silent for his wife's sake, a quiet tension built inside him. She had been kneeling in the flower beds, gloves on, trimming back blooms when the men arrived, their heavy boots crunching on the driveway. They held a notice accusing her of violating some landscape restriction, speaking to her with the curt, condescending tone they had perfected. The sun was high, casting sharp shadows across the yard, and her husband, just inside the house, caught the exchange through the open window. Their body language was aggressive, one man leaning in too close, the other taking photos, turning a routine afternoon of gardening into a confrontation charged with menace. At first her voice was calm but firm, asking for identification and where exactly in the HOA rules the violation was written. The men exchanged a quick glance, their practiced script faltering. One of them tried to bluff, rattling off made-up section numbers while the other shifted his weight impatiently. She straightened up from the flower bed, dirt still on her gloves, and repeated her question louder. Neighbors across the street peeked from their windows, sensing the tension rising. The imposters' tone sharpened, their words clipped and threatening as they demanded compliance. Her refusal to back down pierced the facade they had built, drawing out the hostility they usually hid behind official-sounding language. The moment was sudden and brutal, a slap delivered with the open hand of someone trying to assert dominance rather than defend himself. The sound cracked through the still afternoon like a gunshot, scattering a few birds from the trees. She stumbled back, one hand flying to her cheek, eyes wide with disbelief. The second man looked around quickly, scanning the street for witnesses, while the first adjusted his cap as if to regain control. A curtain twitched across the road. In that instant, the men's disguise of authority dissolved, revealing raw aggression beneath their fake uniform.
Inside the house, he had been rinsing his hands at the kitchen sink, the window open to let in the warm afternoon air. He heard the raised voices first, then the sharp crack of the slap. Instinct overrode routine. His body went still and alert, his heart thudding as adrenaline surged. Through the screen he saw his wife stumble, saw the man looming over her, and in a flash the years of training he had tried to set aside came flooding back. His eyes locked on the imposters with a predator's focus, cataloging their positions, their posture, the distance between them. Every detail sharpened, the angle of the driveway, the weight of the door handle as he pushed it open, the smell of cut grass mixed with his own rising fury. This was no longer a question of HOA rules or fake fines. This was an attack on his home, his family, his promise of safety. The stillness of suburban life shattered in that moment, replaced by the old reflexes he thought he had left behind when he hung up his uniform for good. He crossed the yard in long controlled strides, his voice cutting through the men's bluster before they could react. There was no hesitation, no wasted movement. His hands moved with the precision of muscle memory, positioning himself between his wife and the imposters, eyes scanning for weapons, exits, and potential threats. His presence alone changed the dynamic, broad shoulders squared, jaw set, a calm but deadly composure radiating from him. One man took a step back, surprised at how quickly the situation had turned, but the other tried to assert himself again, reaching for his radio as if it were a badge of power. In a practiced motion the Navy SEAL knocked it from his hand, closing the distance with a speed the imposters couldn't match. Every movement was calculated to neutralize without unnecessary harm, but the controlled violence in his stance made it clear he would not allow another blow. His wife, still stunned, saw in him not just anger, but the unshakable calm of someone who had been here before, someone who knew exactly how to end a threat. The retired SEAL's response unfolded like a series of reflexes honed over decades, not like a brawl but like a sequence of controlled actions, designed to neutralize danger without escalation. As the imposters hesitated, He shifted his weight slightly, angling his body to protect his wife while keeping both men in his peripheral vision. His voice came out low and commanding, the kind of tone that cuts through noise on a battlefield and makes people freeze before they know why. The man who had struck his wife started to raise his hand again, perhaps to push or shove, but the SEAL's hand shot forward, catching the wrist in a grip that was firm yet surgically precise. With a simple twist and pivot, he redirected the man's balance, guiding him down toward the ground rather than hurling him there, forcing the aggressor's arm into a position that left him no choice but to comply. The second man tried to intervene, stepping forward with a burst of bluster, but the SEAL anticipated it. Without taking his eyes off the first, he shifted his stance just enough to bring his free arm up in a barrier, halting the second man's advance. Years of close quarters training had taught him how to move people without striking them, using leverage and positioning rather than brute force. He swept the second man's arm aside and stepped in close, the pressure of his palm at the man's chest enough to push him off balance. In 2 heartbeats, both imposters were no longer the predators but the ones being controlled, their advantage and swagger stripped away by someone who knew exactly where to stand, where to grip, how to make their aggression useless. Neighbors across the street could see only fragments, blurred motions, abrupt shifts, the imposters' startled faces, but to the SEAL everything was deliberate. He guided one man down onto the driveway, pinning his arm behind his back with a knee, while extending his other arm to keep the second at bay. The aggressors were still cursing, still trying to bluster their way out, but their movements had lost the certainty of bullies and taken on the jittery edge of cornered men. He spoke in clipped instructions, ordering them to stay still, his voice like steel drawn from a One reached for his radio again, and the SEAL's hand shot out, plucking it away and tossing it onto the grass without looking. Another tried to twist free and found himself locked tighter, the pressure of a hold that was firm but not vindictive, designed to end the fight rather than inflict pain. In the still air of the neighborhood, the scene felt surreal. A man in plain clothes moving with the discipline of a professional, neutralizing 2 uniformed figures who had for weeks projected authority over everyone else. There was no wild swinging, no shouting, no chaos, only a steady, controlled assertion of strength. His wife, recovering from the shock of being struck, backed toward the porch, but kept her eyes fixed on her husband, the steady rhythm of his movements, as familiar to her as his handwriting. She knew he had wanted a quiet life, had tried to put distance between himself and everything he had once been trained to do. And yet here it was, drawn out of him not by choice but by necessity, triggered by the sight of someone he loved being harmed. The imposters' uniforms now looked flimsy, their patches crooked and their confidence gone. The one pinned to the ground stopped struggling, gasping as the SEAL's weight held him immobile. The other hovered at the edge of action, fists half raised but eyes darting toward the street as if measuring how fast he could run. The SEAL adjusted his grip slightly, tightening enough to keep control but leaving space for the man to breathe, his training guiding him to minimize injury even to someone who had just assaulted his wife. He called out over his shoulder for someone to phone the police, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. Curtains fluttered, phones lifted, and for the first time in weeks, the residents felt the presence of real authority, not the fake kind stamped on paper notices, but the quiet, unshakable kind that comes from conviction and skill. The shift in the street was almost palpable, like a curtain lifting after a long, oppressive performance. For weeks the neighbors had stayed behind their doors, whispering about the imposters, unsure whether they were real or not, feeling alone in their unease. Now, seeing the retired SEAL standing firm, their instincts reversed. One man stepped out from his porch with his phone already dialing 911, his voice steady as he gave the dispatcher the address and described what was happening. A woman across the street opened her gate, crossing the yard quickly to check on the SEAL's wife, her own phone pressed to her ear. Teenagers who had been peeking through blinds started filming, not to sensationalize but to document the truth. The imposters had fed on isolation, unity was their undoing. The more people appeared, the less power the uniforms seemed to hold. A retired teacher who had paid several fines came out holding a stack of the fake notices as evidence. Another neighbor shouted details to the dispatcher about the imposter's vehicle parked down the block. The air buzzed with the sound of phones connecting to emergency services, voices overlapping as people gave their account. The street that had felt like a corridor of surveillance now felt like a gathering ground, residents stepping into the open as if waking from a long sleep. Some neighbors began snapping pictures of the imposters, zooming in on their faces, their patches, their radio. Others took video of the scene from multiple angles, determined to make sure there would be no way for these men to slip away, claiming misunderstanding. The imposters, once so bold, now looked small under the collective gaze. The one not pinned tried to back up slowly, hands slightly raised, muttering about miscommunication,
but found himself surrounded by the eyes of people he had intimidated for weeks. The SEAL's calm presence anchored the moment. He didn't need to shout for help. The simple fact of his intervention had unlocked the courage of others. Neighbors who had avoided each other now spoke quickly, coordinating, confirming that police were on their way. Someone fetched a first aid kit for his wife. Another called the actual HOA office to report what was happening. The imposter's power had always been an illusion propped up by fear and isolation. With fear shattered and isolation gone, they had nothing left to stand on but their own false uniform. Even the children, sensing the change, stepped out from behind their parents' legs, peering at the scene with wide eyes. They had watched the imposters for weeks with a mixture of curiosity and unease. But now they saw adults acting together, and the imposters shrinking under that united front. The street, once silent except for the imposters' footsteps, filled with the sound of neighbors talking, phones clicking, and the faint wail of sirens in the distance, as real law enforcement drew near. In that moment the neighborhood's transformation was visible, not just in the capture of the imposters, but in the people themselves, shoulders squared, voices steady, no longer whispering behind closed doors, but standing out in the sun beside each other. The retired SEAL still had one man restrained on the ground, his posture a study in control rather than aggression, while the other hovered under watchful eyes, his bluster evaporated. The phones kept recording, the calls kept going through, and the collective weight of the community bore down on the imposters, who only minutes before had seemed untouchable. What had begun as an isolated confrontation between one couple and two fake enforcers had become something larger, the point where weeks of fear and hesitation gave way to unity, where a neighborhood's suppressed courage found its voice again. Neighbors who had thought themselves powerless discovered that together they were anything but, and that one act of decisive intervention could break the spell of intimidation that had held them captive. The imposters' radios lay silent in the grass, their fake citations fluttering from doors like torn paper masks, as the residents who had endured them stepped forward to reclaim their street. The rising wail of sirens grew louder, echoing down the rows of houses, until two patrol cars turned sharply into the street. Their lights strobed red and blue across manicured lawns and brick facades, scattering the last illusions the imposters clung to. Uniformed officers stepped out quickly, hands resting near their holsters, scanning the scene with trained eyes. In seconds they took in the retired SEAL kneeling on one man, the second standing rigidly nearby under the collective watch of the neighbors, and the scattered radios and clipboards littering the grass. Their demeanor shifted from caution to authority as they approached, separating the imposters from the civilians with practiced ease. The SEAL released his hold slowly, raising his palms to show he posed no threat, his voice low and calm as he explained what had happened. The officers listened while another pair immediately handcuffed the restrained man, patting him down for weapons. The second imposter tried to talk his way out, his words tumbling over each other about misunderstandings and enforcement duties. But one officer silenced him with a curt command to face the patrol car. The crowd of neighbors moved back a few steps but stayed close enough to witness, phones still raised, their earlier fear replaced by a grim determination to see the charade end. One officer retrieved the stack of fake notices a neighbor had brought, flipping through them with a frown. Another examined the uniforms, pulling at the crooked patches and asking for identification. The imposters produced nothing. No badges, no licenses, no paperwork beyond the fraudulent citation. Within minutes the officers had gathered enough evidence to confirm what the SEAL and others had suspected for weeks. These men were not hired by any HOA, not contractors, not law enforcement of any kind. They were imposters running an organized scam, preying on trust and intimidation. The officers read them their rights, while the neighbors listened, a hush falling over the street as the formal words cut through the air. Handcuffs clicked shut. Radios, clipboards, and cash-filled envelopes were collected as evidence. The imposters were searched again, their pockets emptied of keys, phones, and a handwritten list of house numbers. Officers photographed the scene from multiple angles, ensuring every detail was documented for prosecution. The imposters' earlier swagger was gone, their shoulders slumped as they were guided into the back seats of the patrol cars. The same men who had walked the neighborhood pretending to be its enforcers now sat behind reinforced glass, silent except for the rattle of chains at their neighbors stepped forward one by one to give statements, some still holding the fraudulent fines they had paid, others showing photos or videos they had taken during the weeks of intimidation. The officers thanked them for their cooperation, explaining how the evidence would help build a strong case. As the information was gathered, the SEAL's wife stood near the porch, a gentle mark still visible on her cheek, but her posture steady, surrounded by neighbors offering quiet words of support. The patrol car's lights continued to spin, casting long shifting shadows across the street as the illusion of authority the imposters had created crumbled completely under the weight of real law enforcement. Inside the cars, the imposters stared straight ahead, their uniforms now nothing more than costumes under the harsh glow of police flashlights. The officers closed the doors, the locks clunking audibly, and moved to confer about transport and evidence. The neighborhood, so recently silent and fearful, had become a scene of official action, with note-taking officers, camera flashes and clusters of residents comparing experiences openly, instead of whispering behind curtains. The scam that had thrived on secrecy was now exposed under the unflinching light of accountability. Keynote 16. The neighborhood rallied together afterward, vowing never again to be intimidated and praising the Navy SEALs' decisive action. In the days that followed the arrests, the street took on a different rhythm. Where there had once been nervous glances and quick retreats indoors, there were now clusters of neighbors talking openly on sidewalks, swapping stories of what they had endured and how close they had come to confronting the imposters themselves. The HOA sent out an official letter confirming the men had never been employed or authorized, outlining steps being taken to prevent similar scams. Real security patrols, this time verified and in proper uniforms, made brief appearances to reassure residents. Neighbors who had barely spoken before began organizing. They created a group chat to share updates, compiled copies of the fake notices for investigators, and even planned a neighborhood meeting on the very lawn where the confrontation had occurred. At that meeting, people who had once felt ashamed of their silence stood up to thank the SEAL and his wife. Some admitted how frightened they had been, how powerless they had felt, and how his intervention had jolted them out of that paralysis. Others offered to help cover any costs the couple might have incurred or simply shook their hands in gratitude. Children resumed playing on the sidewalks, parents watching with a renewed sense of vigilance, but also relief. Decorative flags and garden ornaments slowly reappeared on lawns. Cars once again parked freely along the curbs without fear of false tickets. The subtle signs of normalcy returning felt like acts of defiance against the weeks of intimidation. Residents exchanged phone numbers, set up a neighborhood watch that was truly their own, and invited the SEAL to share some of his expertise on personal safety and awareness. Local media picked up the story, framing it as an example of how ordinary communities can be targeted by imposters, and how decisive action can break such schemes. Reporters interviewed neighbors on camera, and though the SEAL himself declined the spotlight, preferring his privacy, his role was recounted again and again by those who had witnessed it. His wife, still soft-spoken but firm, described how quickly everything had happened, how the moment of violence had triggered not chaos but a controlled response that ended the imposters' reign over their street. This public attention further united the residents. They used the momentum to push for clearer communication from the HOA, better verification systems for contractors, and a direct line to local law enforcement for suspicious activity. People who had once been content to let others handle community issues now stepped forward to volunteer, forming committees to improve safety and communication. The sense of vulnerability that had gripped them was replaced by a sense of agency, the knowledge that their voices mattered, and that collective action could protect their homes better than fear ever could. The SEAL and his wife found themselves at the center of a network of new friendships. Neighbors brought over dinners, offered to help with their yard work, and invited them to gatherings as a gesture of appreciation. The couple accepted quietly, touched by the change but also cautious, knowing that what had happened was not just about one act of heroism, but about an entire community learning to stand up for itself. They continued their evening porch sits, now often joined by others stopping to chat rather than hurrying past. The sound of laughter returned to the cul-de-sac, mingling with the hum of sprinklers and the smell of barbecue, the ordinary joys that had once defined the place. Even as investigators pursued charges, fraud, impersonation, assault, the neighborhood's focus shifted from victimhood to vigilance. They created laminated cards with emergency contacts, taught their children how to recognize real uniforms and badges, and began greeting strangers with polite but firm questions rather than automatic trust. The imposter's arrest had not only removed a threat but had sparked a cultural change, a new balance between openness and caution. Where once fear had isolated them, the experience had bound the residents together. They no longer assumed someone else would act first. They understood that unity was their strongest defense. In block parties, yard sales, and informal meetings, the story of the imposter's downfall became part of neighborhood lore, retold as a cautionary tale, and a reminder of the day the street reclaimed its peace. The retired SEAL, though modest about his role, became a living emblem of that turning point, his quiet presence a reassurance that courage and discipline could still stand between harm and home.